The New York skyline was shrouded in a relentless storm, rain lashing against the towering skyscrapers, painting a scene both breathtaking and ominous. On the 50th floor of Westward Capitol, Sophie Carter remained at her desk, working tirelessly despite the late hour. She couldn't leave. An error had surfaced in a multi-million-dollar investment deal. If it wasn't corrected in time, the consequences would be catastrophic. Sophie tried to focus, but tension gnawed at the edges of her mind. Suddenly, the office door creaked open. Damian Westwood, the billionaire CEO of the firm, a man both respected and feared, stood in the doorway, his sharp gaze scanning her screen. "Still here, Carter?" His voice was deep and smooth, carrying an undertone of curiosity, but there was something in his eyes that made Sophie's heart race. Sophie tensed, but quickly composed herself. "I just found a critical error in the investment deal. If we don't fix it now, we could lose millions." Damian frowned, stepping closer, his sharp eyes scanning the numbers on her screen. "Show me." He pulled out a chair beside her, his presence commanding, impossible to ignore. Sophie pointed at the data, explaining the discrepancies. Damian listened in silence, his focus razor-sharp. Outside, thunder rumbled, lightning slashing through the night sky, and then the entire building went dark. Silence. Sophie inhaled sharply as realization hit her. The security system had locked the doors automatically. She checked her phone. No signal. Damian tried the door, but it didn't budge. He turned back, his expression calm but firm. "We're stuck." They stared at each other in the darkness, the only sounds the relentless rain against the glass and the storm's distant roar. Trapped with Damian Westwood, the man she had spent years trying to keep at a professional distance, Sophie wasn't sure if this was luck or something far more dangerous. Darkness swallowed the office whole, broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning illuminating the glass windows. Sophie clenched her hands, steadying herself against the unsettling silence. "We should find a flashlight," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. Damian didn't hesitate. He strode toward the emergency cabinet, his movements swift and purposeful. The sound of metal clinking echoed in the dimly lit space as he rummaged through supplies. Moments later, he pulled out 2 small lanterns and switched them on. A soft golden glow filled the room, casting long shadows across the walls. Sophie exhaled in relief, but just as she did, a shiver ran down her spine. Whether it was from the chill in the air or something else entirely, she wasn't sure. Without a word, Damian shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Sophie stiffened, startled by the unexpected gesture. "You're cold," he said simply, his voice firm yet oddly gentle. She opened her mouth to protest, but then stopped. The fabric was still warm, carrying the distinct scent of him, woodsy, clean, and undeniably masculine. "Thanks," she murmured, pulling it closer around herself. Damian perched on the edge of her desk, arms crossed over his chest, watching her with a gaze she couldn't quite read. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. "I didn't expect you to be here this late," he finally said. Sophie let out a small laugh. "I could say the same about you." His lips quirked slightly, the amusement flickering in his eyes. "Then tell me, Sophie Carter, why finance?" She blinked. Damian wasn't the kind of man to ask casual questions, especially not about personal choices. Still, after a moment of hesitation, she answered. "I didn't come from wealth. No one in my family worked in finance, but I wanted more. I wanted to build something for myself, something no one could take away." Damian was quiet, as if weighing her words. "I understand that," he finally said, his voice lower than before. Sophie tilted her head. "And you? You already have everything. Why do you still push yourself so hard?" Damian let out a quiet chuckle, though there was something distant in his gaze. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything." For the first time, Sophie saw him not as the untouchable billionaire, but as a man, someone who had fought his own battles, carried his own scars. Sophie leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, her eyes tracing the storm-ridden city below. New York never stopped moving, even under the heaviest rain. The streets shimmered with reflections of headlights, the skyscrapers stood resilient against the howling wind. She had always loved this city, restless, unyielding, refusing to bow to any storm. Behind her, Damian stepped closer, the lantern's warm glow casting soft shadows across his sharp, defined features. "The storm can cut the power, shut down half the city," Sophie murmured, her gaze still fixed outside. "But it can't stop this place." Damian's voice was lower, closer, just like you. Slowly, Sophie turned her head to meet his eyes, that piercing steel blue gaze, steady, intense, unreadable. She took a breath, steeling herself for what she had never dared to say before. "I've always been drawn to you, Damian," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "From the first day I stepped into this company, but I never let myself show it." Damian didn't look shocked. If anything, there was a quiet understanding in his expression. He tilted his head slightly, watching her carefully. "Sophie, do you think I haven't noticed?" She held his gaze, waiting. Damian exhaled deeply, as if battling something within himself. And then, finally, he admitted the truth he had kept buried for years. "I've been watching you for a long time," he said, his voice rougher, lower. "But I held back. Because I wasn't supposed to cross that line." Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the towering buildings. "Then why now?" Sophie asked, her breath unsteady. Damian looked at her for a long moment before a quiet, knowing smile touched his lips. Half exasperation, half surrender. "Because I can't pretend anymore." A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, bright enough to turn night into day for a fleeting moment. Their reflections in the glass stood impossibly close, on the edge of something irreversible. Damian lifted a hand, fingers brushing softly against her cheek, his touch impossibly warm despite the cold. He hesitated. His breathing was uneven, his gaze searching hers. One last moment of restraint, one last chance to stop. But Sophie wasn't stepping away. Instead, she lifted her hand, resting it against his chest, feeling the erratic beat of his heart beneath her palm. That was all it took. Everything else faded. The storm, the city, the world beyond these walls. Only them, only the heat between them, only the moment, stretched taut with anticipation. And then Damian pulled her into a kiss. Deep, demanding, a culmination of years of restraint finally breaking free. Sophie melted into him, her hands gripping his shirt, holding onto something she had denied herself for too long. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, an entirely different kind of storm had just begun. Damian's kiss was fierce, consuming Sophie like a storm, washing away every last shred of restraint. She didn't hesitate, her fingers gripping the collar of his shirt, pulling him closer. So close, there was no space left between them. There was no turning back now, no more barriers. Damian turned them, pressing her gently against the glass. Outside, lightning slashed through the sky, illuminating their reflections. Two silhouettes locked in an embrace neither of them could deny any longer. His breath was warm against her skin, one hand gripping her waist, the other tracing a slow, deliberate path down her back. Sophie shivered, not from the cold, but from the heat between them, from the way Damian touched her as if he had been waiting years to do so. "Sophie," his voice was rough, strained. She tilted her head up, meeting his gaze. Her heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears, but she no longer cared about the consequences. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from need. That was all it took. Damian growled softly, his restraint snapping. With effortless strength, he lifted her, and she instinctively wrapped her legs around his waist. Sophie gasped as his arms tightened around her, the feel of him sending a shiver of anticipation through her body. "My office," Damian murmured against her ear, his voice thick with hunger. Sophie nodded, unable to form words. They moved through the darkened hallway, guided by instinct rather than sight. The moment they entered Damian's private office, he kicked the door shut behind them. Before she could fully take in her surroundings, he placed her on the edge of his massive mahogany desk. The cool surface beneath her was a stark contrast to the fire burning between them. Damian's lips found hers again, demanding and unrelenting, his hands exploring, memorizing, claiming. Sophie arched into him, her fingers slipping through his hair, holding on as if letting go would break whatever fragile control they still had left. There was no hesitance now, no doubts. Only them. Only this moment. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Damian's office, another storm had erupted, one neither of them wanted to stop. The first golden rays of morning spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the sleek office. The storm had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean by the rain. Sophie stirred, warmth enveloping her. She blinked awake, disoriented for only a moment, before she felt the solid, steady presence beside her. "Damian?" She turned slightly, her breath catching when she realized he was already awake, watching her. His expression was unreadable, but different. Gone was the cold, impenetrable mask he wore in the office. In its place was something softer, something dangerous in its intensity. Possession. Affection. Sophie's pulse stuttered. She had fallen asleep in Damian Westwood's arms. No longer just CEO and employee. Everything had changed. Damian lifted a hand, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. His fingers lingered, tracing the edge of her jaw as if he wasn't quite ready to let go. "Do you regret it?" His voice was deep, steady. Sophie held his gaze, her heart beat loud in her ears. "No." A slow, knowing smile curved his lips. "Good, because neither do I." There was no question between them now, no pretending. But Damian was a man who thrived on control, and Sophie knew the complications that came with an office romance, especially one with him. "We need to keep this quiet," she murmured. Damian studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Until we figure out how to handle it." Sophie smiled, knowing everything had changed, but also knowing that Damian Westwood never let go of something he wanted. And this time he wanted her 3 months later. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. 2 clear lines. She was pregnant. Not with 1 baby, with 3. Her heart pounded as she reached for the ultrasound photo on her nightstand, tracing the small blurry shapes on the screen. It was overwhelming, exciting, and terrifying all at once. She had never expected her life to take such a drastic turn. One night with Damian Westwood, and now she was going to be a mother. And now she had to tell him. When Sophie stepped into Damian's office, her pulse raced. He stood by the window, dressed in his signature black suit, his broad shoulders rigid, his focus seemingly lost in the city skyline. But the moment she entered, his sharp blue gaze snapped to her, assessing. Always assessing. "Sophie?" His brow furrowed slightly. "What's wrong?" She swallowed hard, gripping the ultrasound photo in her hands. "I have something to tell you." Damian set his phone down, his full attention now on her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he studied her that made her believe. He already knew. "Tell me," he said, his voice steady but firm. Sophie hesitated for a fraction of a second before handing him the ultrasound. "I'm pregnant." The room fell into complete silence. Damian's gaze locked onto the image in his hands. For several long seconds, he simply stared at it, unmoving. "How far along?" His voice was calm, but there was an underlying edge to it, something restrained. 3 months, Sophie whispered. His jaw tightened slightly, his fingers flexing around the edges of the ultrasound. "Is it 1 baby or 3?" she cut in before he could finish. The silence that followed was deafening. 3? Damian repeated, his voice quieter now, as if he was trying to grasp the reality of it. Sophie nodded, her heartbeat erratic as she braced herself for his reaction. And then something completely unexpected happened. Damian smiled. Not a smirk, not the controlled, practiced grin he used in boardrooms. A real, unfiltered smile. 3 babies. His voice was rough, thick with something Sophie couldn't quite place. "Sophie Carter, you never do anything halfway, do you?" A watery laugh escaped her, and before she knew it, tears streamed down her face. She had expected shock, maybe even hesitation. But Damian proved her wrong. Within days, he arranged everything: private doctors, a new penthouse filled with every luxury she could possibly need, a personal team dedicated to ensuring she and their children were taken care of. And more than that, he made sure the world knew. Unlike their hidden relationship, Damian had no intention of keeping this a secret. At an exclusive financial gala, when an investor made a not-so-subtle remark about Sophie Carter's close relationship with the CEO of Westwood Capital, Damian didn't hesitate. Instead, he simply took her hand in front of the entire room. "She's not just someone important to me," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "She is my woman." Gasps rippled through the audience, whispers spreading like wildfire. The news exploded across Wall Street within hours. Sophie wasn't sure how to react. Shocked, overwhelmed, maybe even a little terrified. But when she turned to look at Damian, saw the unshakable certainty in his expression, she knew. He had chosen her. And this time, he wasn't letting her go. 1 year later, Sophie stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the silk dress that hugged her figure. The Westwood Capital Anniversary Gala was always an extravagant affair, attended by the most powerful figures in finance. But this year, the spotlight wasn't just on Damian Westwood. It was on the woman who had changed his life. Sophie glanced at the crib where her 3 babies lay sleeping peacefully. A year ago, she never imagined herself having a family. And yet, here she was. She had everything. That night, Damian never left her side. His hand remained firm on the small of her back, silently telling the world that she belonged to him. People whispered about how much Damian had changed, how the once cold, untouchable billionaire now softened whenever he looked at Sophie. But no one knew that tonight, there would be an even bigger surprise. As the music quieted, Damian suddenly took Sophie's hand and led her toward the stage. Sophie frowned. "What are you doing?" Damian simply smiled. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Under the dazzling lights, in front of hundreds of people, Damian Westwood dropped to one knee, pulling out a black velvet box. Gasps rippled through the room. Sophie's breath caught, her hands trembling as she stared at him, not as the powerful CEO, but as the man she loved, offering her his heart. "Sophie Carter." Damian's voice was deep, steady, filled with raw emotion. "You changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You gave me a family, 3 perfect little angels, and a reason to wake up every morning with something to look forward to." He opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring. "And now, I want to do what I should have done long ago, ask you to be my wife." Sophie's throat tightened. She had never been the kind of woman who dreamed about fairy tale proposals. But standing here, watching the man she loved on one knee, eyes filled with devotion, she knew there was no world where she could say no. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes." The room erupted in applause as Damian rose, pulling her into a deep, passionate kiss. Now, the entire world knew Sophie Carter wasn't just the mother of his children. She was his forever. Years later, Sophie sat in their garden, watching their 3 little ones run through the grass, their laughter filling the air. Damian approached, setting a cup of tea in her hands before pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think we should have another one," he teased, his blue eyes twinkling. Sophie laughed. "3 isn't enough for you?" Damian smirked, wrapping his arms around her. "No, I want a whole football team." She shook her head, but there was no denying the joy in her heart. The storm had passed, and now she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of Damian Westwood, the man she loved more than anything. A love forever.